So we'll continue through the Parasha readings. This week we've got another action-packed, juicy Parasha, Shelach, which means literally sent or send. And I'm going to talk about the sins of the spies. I have given a similar talk to this previously in, I think last year I gave this talk. I have sort of edited it and added some new material and taken out some other material which I thought was not as relevant. I've sort of shifted this not only to talk about the events at hand and also its context in Jewish history, but also try and give some gospel relevance as well to the parasha. So that's the main difference compared to my last presentation of this portion. As you can see from the screen, we've got Numbers, essentially chapters 13 to 15, Joshua chapter 2, and Numbers chapter 10, verses 1 to 14. So just a bit of a recap of our current situation. We know that Israel's in the desert. They've been in the desert for actually over 2 years now. A few major things have happened along the way, of course. In particular, in the life of the nation, the Levites have been inaugurated into the service of the tabernacle, into the ritual service. The first Sanhedrin was constituted. People talk about how, what authority do the rabbis derive from to actually give themselves the authority to interpret the Torah. They derive it for whether we disagree with it or not. They derive it from this particular portion, not this particular portion, Shelach, but from actually last week in terms of the 70 elders being appointed by Moses to help judge the affairs of the people. So initially, Moses was having to deal with all the sort of disputes himself, and the Torah had been given, more or less, but of course it has to be interpreted for each individual situation. It's a very practical framework. And of course, Moses would have been very overwhelmed by judging literally every single dispute or every single question. So he appointed 70 trusted elders, wise men who are learned in the instructions of God, to help him with this decision-making process. So that's sort of the first Jewish court, we can say, the first Sanhedrin. Israel, of course, continues their grumbling about multiple things, unfortunately. Lately, the manna in the desert, so the miraculous food that came from heaven each morning, that they didn't have to do much work to really get, except to collect it every morning. They started complaining about that. And God, essentially, the people were asking for meat, and then God gave them meat, but unfortunately, that also was accompanied by God's wrath as well. There were people who died as well, just, as a punishment for essentially grumbling about the miraculous food they got from heaven every morning. Imagine if our lives were so simple that we didn't have to do anything to get our food, didn't have to work, didn't have to do anything, just open the front door and there was the food on the floor, as widespread as the frost. So that's pretty amazing miracle, really. And it continued all the way through the 40 years. And lastly, in last week's portion, we read a situation where Moses' siblings, in particular his sister Miriam, criticizes him. And God actually backs Moses. He justifies Moses and actually punishes Miriam as a result of that with leprosy. So this week, as the namesake of the parasha suggests, the main topic is the sending. And there's the sending of the spies, as you guys might remember. One spy from each tribe, all 12 spies in total, was sent from the wilderness into the land of Israel to do reconnaissance. So what do I mean by reconnaissance? They were there to inspect the land, to give a report about the land, to give a report about the cities and the inhabitants, and to essentially give Moses and the nation a report on various important aspects of the land itself. So it was a very important information-finding mission. The prophets portion also relates to a situation regarding spies. This time, 2 spies sent from Joshua's camp into Jericho to also perform reconnaissance as well. And it talks about how the prostitute Rahab hid the spies, and she was later rewarded as a result. Her and her family were not wiped out with the inhabitants of Jericho when Israel did invade. And the New Testament portion describes how Jesus sent his disciples to preach the good news to the Jews only at this stage. So it's sort of not really a well talked about fact today, but initially the gospel did only go to the Jews, and only later it went to the Gentiles. As we read from Matthew 10, verses 5 and 6, these 12, so the disciples Jesus sent out, instructing them, "Go nowhere among the Gentiles and enter no town of the Samaritans, but rather go rather to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." So interesting to think about this, because we don't really think about this in sort of the modern church context, how initially quite specific the gospel was to the Jews. So again, very interesting to sort of remind ourselves of this fact as we read the portion. So I do want to focus our talk mainly on the relevance and significance of the report of the spies, because it had huge significance for the nation of Israel from then on in Jewish history. So the report can be found in Numbers chapter 13, verses 27 to 32. And I'll read it for us. And they told him, "We came to the land to which you sent us. It flows with milk and honey, and this is its fruit. However, the people who dwell in the land are strong, and the cities are fortified and very large. And besides, we saw the descendants of Anak there, Nephilim. The Amalekites dwell in the land of the Negev. The Hittites, the Jebusites, and the Amorites dwell in the hill country, and the Canaanites dwell by the sea and along the Jordan." But Caleb quieted the people before Moses and said, "Let us go up at once and occupy it, for we are well able to overcome it." Then the men who had gone up with him said, "We are not able to go up against the people, for they are stronger than we are." So they brought to the people of Israel a bad report of the land that they had spied out, saying, "The land through which we have gone to spy it out is a land that devours its inhabitants, and all the people that we saw in it are of great height." They're actually talking about me, because I'm also of great height. No, only kidding. Not what they were talking about. So essentially, in summary, the report states that the land is a good land. It is indeed a land of milk and honey. But 10 out of the 12 spies, so Caleb and Joshua were the only exceptions, the spies generally lacked confidence that the Israelites were strong enough to overcome the inhabitants. So they thought if they would go into the land, they would be devoured, they would be destroyed. And this is despite the fact that they were always a small nation, an insignificant nation, but God had delivered them before. And this was a generation that came out of Egypt and saw God's miracles in the land of Egypt. So despite the fact that they saw these miracles and they saw the great power of God to deliver Israel, they still did not have the faith to go into the land. And Caleb, a bit later on, actually appeals to this faith. He actually says that he actually appeals that because of what they saw in Egypt through God's strong hand, that they could rely on him to deliver them into the promised land. But unfortunately the other spies did not agree with them, and they not only themselves were shaken with fear, but they also inspired fear into the camp of Israel. So this caused a great moaning and great wailing. The Israelites were scared, they were worried, similar to how a lot of us are concerned or worried about the coronavirus at the moment. They all wanted to go back to Egypt. They were so terrified, and they had felt so helpless. They said it's better to die in Egypt than to die here. So again, a really terrible situation for morale in the camp. And of course, Moses, seeing the lack of faith and the grumbling of the camp, he became very angry, and he wanted to destroy the whole nation, but only for Moses' intercession. So we'll talk about intercession later, but essentially God relents from punishing Israel only because Moses begs and prays and really just implores God to spare Israel of his wrath. The 10 spies who did give the negative report, they were to die. They died in the plague. The rest of the people were not killed straight away, but as a punishment, they wandered the desert for 40 years, essentially. So no one after the age of 20 would be able to enter the land, except for Caleb and Joshua. So people often wonder, why did Israel wander for 40 years? There's no way they would have gotten lost in the land, in the wilderness for 40 years, especially with God leading them. So the reason why they wandered for 40 years was because of this. It was actually a punishment for the sin of the spies, the nation who doubted God, and despite seeing his miracles, would not get to see the promise. So that was the punishment that they were given. And the tradition actually goes on to say that it's because of this lack of faith that they were not able to enter the land. Not even actually Moses and Aharon, the two leaders of the people, were actually able to enter the land as well. So only Caleb and Joshua were able to from that generation, and Joshua was the one, as you know, who was the next leader of the nation of Israel in the land while they were conquering the land. So this particular event, the event of the sin of the spies, event is seen as extremely significant in Jewish tradition, because it is seen to be the start of a bad trend in Jewish history, a trend of very unfortunate, sad days to occur at this time. So the Jewish sages teach on this day that God will punish future generations. So we can read this in the Gemara, which is sort of the commentary on the Talmud, in the Tractate Ta'anis 29a. Excuse me. And I'm going to quote a very small part of the Gemara, which gives us the source for this day. Rabbah said that Rabbi Yochanan said, that night was the night of the 9th of Av. The Holy One, blessed is He, said to them, you wept needlessly that night, and I will therefore establish for you a true tragedy of which there will be weeping in future generations. So with this inspiration in mind, the Hebrew month of Av, the 5th month, on the 9th day, also called Tisha B'Av, was established. And this is the saddest day of the Jewish calendar, which is accompanied by much mourning, fasting and sadness, rendering of the garments sometimes as well. It's a really sad, mournful day. It's coming up relatively shortly, actually, not too far away. And many, many different events throughout Jewish history. We can actually record some of these events, and we know these for sure, actually occurred on this day. So in the Gemara, God promises Israel that there will be genuine reasons to cry on this day, sort of as a perpetual punishment for the nation of Israel crying unnecessarily that night. And there are many, many examples of how this has unfortunately come true. So even though it's not strictly scriptural, there is obviously inference from the Jewish tradition. Unfortunately, through recorded history, we've actually seen examples of this come true. And I'll give only 5 examples. There's actually many more examples. If you Google this topic, literally Google, Tisha B'Av, bad things which happen to the Jewish people, something along those lines, you will see huge lists compiled which show terrible events which happened to the Jewish people on this day as well. But just to give some examples, so the destruction of both temples was traditionally attributed on the 9th of Av. The final defeat of Bar Kokhba at Beitar in 133 CE was also on the 9th of Av. So that was the Bar Kokhba revolt was the last rebellion against Rome to try and re-establish Jewish sovereignty in the land of Israel. And this is actually after the temple's destruction, 63 years later. And these were a group of people who believed that Bar Kokhba, because he initially brought actually a few victories, they actually managed to regain some sort of independence for a few years, 3 years actually. They thought he was the Messiah who would bring the political victories, bring Israel out of oppression, out of subservience to their enemies. However, as we know, that the revolt was eventually crushed, and it was crushed to such a degree that Israel was exiled for nearly 2,000 years afterwards. So really a terrible day. The expulsion of the Jews from England in 1290 also occurred on Tisha B'Av. That's a recorded date in history. The expulsion from the Jews of Spain in 1492 also occurred on the 9th of Av. And a more modern example, the World War I started in 1914, also on Tisha B'Av. And many historians believe that the events of the First World War, Germany's defeat and humiliation, led to the rise of Hitler and therefore the Second World War and therefore the Holocaust. So again, not an insignificant event for the Jewish people. And many more examples, as I've mentioned, could be given. So now that we've sort of talked about the, seeming harshness of this decree and all the punishments that Israel has been given, there's also a very strong aspect of mercy in this punishment. So on first glance, the punishment for 40 years of wandering in the desert sounds harsh. However, considering that on the Spies reports, the nation was actually just as unfaithful as they were, they had to be considered almost as guilty. Even though the Spies were the one who gave the reports, the nation readily believed it. The nation didn't question them in the same way that Caleb and Joshua did. The nation didn't join towards Caleb and Joshua. There was no one else who sided with them except Caleb and Joshua, as far as we know from the scriptures. And as a result, you have to consider the nation almost as guilty as the Spies. Now, instead of God striking them down directly as a result, God didn't do that. He actually allowed them to live their natural lifespans in the wilderness. He doesn't kill them straight away in a plague. The people are allowed to live, they're allowed to work, they're allowed to play, allowed to marry, allowed to have children, allowed to live normal, regular lives in the wilderness. There are many, many nations throughout history who have lived dignified and full lives in the wilderness in similar circumstances. And these people would actually have access to God's provision and God's protection, which never left them throughout the whole journey. And also continue to receive food from heaven, the manna, for 40 years. They would never go without. And as far as punishments goes, that's a pretty merciful punishment when you think about how grave their sin was, essentially not trusting God, even though they had seen with their own eyes what he could do. This is a punishment which bears a huge amount of mercy. And Moses interceding for the people made this all possible. And I'll talk about Moses' intercession because it really is significant for us, especially from a gospel perspective. So I'm reading from Numbers chapter 14, verses 13 to 19. But Moses said to the Lord, "Then the Egyptians will hear of it, for you brought up this people in your might from among them, and they will tell the inhabitants of this land, they have heard that you, O Lord, are in the midst of this people. For you, O Lord, are seen face to face, and your cloud stands over them, and you go before them, in a pillar of cloud by day, and in a pillar of fire by night. Now, if you kill this people as one man, then the nations who have heard your fame will say, it is because the Lord was not able to bring this people into the land that he swore to give it to them, that he has killed them in the wilderness. And now, please, let the power of the Lord be great as you have promised, saying, the Lord is slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love, forgiving iniquity and transgression, but he will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and fourth generation. Please pardon the iniquity of his people, according to the greatness of your steadfast love, just as you have forgiven this people from Egypt until now." This really is a truly amazing intercession by Moses. So first, he appeals to God's glory and the honor of his name among the people. He reminds God that his reputation among the Egyptians and among the neighboring nations relies on the success of the fulfillment of the promises. Without the fulfillment of the promises, God's name would not be great among the nations. He then appeals to his attributes of mercy. So this section, the Lord is slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love until the visiting the iniquity of the fathers of the children to the third and fourth generation. That is the sort of the body of the attributes of mercy. It's a prayer which Jews to this day still say in Jewish prayer for mercy and for forgiveness from God, and it's a really powerful appeal to God's mercy, and it's one that has stuck with the Jewish people for thousands of years. Then Moses appeals directly to God's steadfast love, and also reminds him that of the other times that he has forgiven Israel in his love, ever since they left Egypt. Even since they left Egypt, there's been many times when Israel has needed God's forgiveness. And in this mindset, we can see that we need an intercessor. In the Jewish, I guess the non-Messianic Jewish mindset, traditionally, Jews have always been very sort of proud of this fact that we can directly approach God without the need for a Messiah, without the need for an intercessor. And this is partially true. It's also true for believers as well. We can directly approach God through Yeshua the Messiah. We don't need to go through a priest. We don't need to go through a holy person. But it's only partially true. I would say that our history has shown us over and over again that we would have been much worse off, would have been destroyed many times over without the interceding work of our biblical heroes. We need the Messiah more than ever to intercede for us. The example of Moses epitomizes what Jesus does for us. We are worthy of destruction due to our sins. God's mercy is only kindled by the intercession of one that is worthy. Yeshua was the only one that was worthy to intercede for our sins on a grand scale that he did. Now, in the desert among the Israelites, Moses fulfilled that function, as we could see, but now Yeshua, Jesus, fulfills that function for Israel and the whole world. However, it must be remembered that the intercessionary process is not passive. It requires a response from us. As Moses' intercession could not save those that had directly sinned, the most grievous sin of the 10 spies, if we do not endeavor to obey, his or Yeshua's intercession will not save us. And we can see this from 1 John chapter 2, verses 1 to 6. My little children, I am writing these things to you so that you may not sin. But if anyone does sin, we have an advocate with the Father, Yeshua the Messiah, the righteous. He is the propitiation for our sins, and not for ours only, but also for the sins of the whole world. And by this we know that we have come to know him, if we keep his commandments. Whoever says, I know him, but does not keep his commandments is a liar, and the truth is not in him. But whoever keeps his word, in him truly the love of God is perfected. By this we may know that we are in him. Whoever says he abides in him ought to walk in the same way in which he walked. Now, this is not to downplay the role of faith in accepting the intercession of Yeshua, but at the same time, there is often made a false dichotomy between faith and obeying or righteous actions. In reality, they go together. If someone does not produce the fruit of faith, then the book of 1 John calls them a liar. Then they never actually really believed properly in the first place. He's essentially assuming that the person who truly believes will produce the right fruit. I'm also reminded, though, in the promise and hope of our Messiah, how God promises that when all is fulfilled, one day our saddest and most mournful days, which Tisha B'Av from a Jewish perspective is the saddest day, they will all become days of joy and feasting. And we read this from Zechariah chapter 8, verse 19. Thus says the Lord of hosts, the fast of the 4th month and the fast of the 5th, which is Tisha B'Av, and the fast of the 7th and the fast of the 10th shall be to the house of Judah seasons of joy and gladness and cheerful feasts. Therefore love truth and peace.